In the Combat Information Center of the USS Princeton, on a November night in 2004, the screens were doing exactly what they were supposed to do. The AN/SPY-1B Aegis phased array radar, a system recently upgraded, recently certified, recently confirmed to be operating at full specification, was painting the Southern California operating area in slow, precise sweeps. The returns came back as they always came back out here. Commercial traffic at altitude to the northeast, climbing out of San Diego and Los Angeles on familiar westward headings. The occasional military contact transiting the operating area on logged and coordinated tracks. The flat, dark surface of the Pacific returning its own low signature beneath the antenna's reach. The operators at their consoles had seen this picture many hundreds of times. They knew its textures. They knew which blips belonged and which belonged somewhere else, and they knew how to read the difference in the time it takes to form a thought. The Princeton was a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser, hull designation CG-59, and she sat within the formation of Carrier Strike Group 11, approximately 100 miles southwest of San Diego, California. The Pacific at that latitude and that time of year was wide and deep and mostly unlit past the running lights of the formation itself. The strike group was at sea on a standard pre-deployment training workup, a certification exercise conducted in the weeks before a carrier group deploys to a combat theater, designed to stress and validate every system and every crew to find the gaps in readiness while there was still time and distance enough to address them. Everything was running as it was supposed to run. That was the nature of the period. Normal operations conducted by experienced people in a well-mapped stretch of ocean they had all worked before. The Princeton's Combat Information Center sat deep inside the ship's superstructure, away from the weather and the noise of the sea. The overhead lighting in a CIC is typically kept low, dimmed enough that the screens dominate, their soft blue-green glow the primary source of illumination in the compartment. An operator seated at the AN/SPY-1B console in the Princeton CIC on any given night during that exercise would have seen their own hands lit from below, the pale wash of the display reflecting up across their face, the rest of the compartment receding into the comfortable, functional dark that naval operations centers maintain as a matter of course. Screens in those rooms tell you everything. The room itself fades. The data holds. The USS Nimitz, CVN-68, the lead ship of her class, a nuclear-powered supercarrier that had been in service since 1975, was the flagship of the strike group. She was a large vessel by any measure, her flight deck stretching longer than 3 American football fields, her displacement at sea exceeding 90,000 tons. In November 2004, she was home to approximately 5,000 sailors and officers, a wing of aircraft, and all the ordinary life that accumulates aboard a ship, operating far enough from port that the horizon is water in every direction. The Nimitz moved through her routines as a ship that size moves through routines, with the settled, faintly mechanical quality of an institution that has learned to sustain itself independently of the shore, its rhythms internal, its pace determined by the operational schedule rather than by anything as variable as weather or mood. Strike Fighter Squadron 41, the Black Aces, was one of the aviation squadrons embarked aboard the Nimitz for the workup. The squadron flew the F/A-18F Super Hornet, a 2-seat multi-role fighter aircraft that had entered fleet service in 1999 and had largely supplanted the earlier single-seat F/A-18C in carrier air wing operations. The F model paired a pilot in the front cockpit with a weapons systems officer in the rear, extending the crew's capacity to manage the aircraft's sensor suite and weapons systems while the pilot focused on flight. The Super Hornet was a large aircraft by fighter standards, heavier and somewhat less agile than its predecessor, but capable in the air-to-air and air-to-ground roles, and the Black Aces flew it with the practiced ease of a squadron well into a training cycle. Commanding the Black Aces during the November 2004 workup was Commander David Fravor, a naval aviator with more than 3,000 flight hours and 2 combat deployments to his name, a figure inside the squadron regarded as precisely the kind of commanding officer a fighter squadron in a pre-deployment workup needs: technically fluent, professionally composed, experienced enough to have seen a great deal, and not yet inclined to dramatize any of it. On the Nimitz's flight deck during the nighttime hours of the training period, the aircraft sat in their spotted positions with the characteristic discipline of carrier aviation logistics. Wings were folded upward into the parked configuration, reducing each aircraft's footprint to something a flight deck crew could work around in the compressed real estate of a carrier deck. The deck edge lighting, amber designed to preserve the night vision of the deck crew while still illuminating the working spaces between aircraft, cast the rows of folded Super Hornets in a warm, low light that flattened their shapes against the dark of the sea beyond the ship's sides. The island superstructure rose on the starboard side, its running lights and navigation lights adding their own colors to the deck's amber. Below the flight deck, in the hangar bay that occupied the carrier's midsection, the smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid was constant and pervasive. The characteristic ambient smell of a carrier in operation, one that gets into the clothing of everyone aboard and follows them through the passageways and into the berthing spaces until it becomes simply the smell of the ship, noticed only by those who have been away for long enough to register its return. Commander Fravor's days during that period were the days of a commanding officer in a training workup, flight briefs and debriefs, squadron administrative work, coordination with the air wing and the ship's operations center, the ordinary accumulation of tasks that fills the schedule of anyone responsible for a unit of that size during a certification exercise. The passageways of the Nimitz connect its compartments in the way that a working city connects its districts, through routes that become automatic with repetition, past ventilation gratings and pipe runs and the padded edges of watertight doors, past the sounds of the ship's systems doing their continuous work. The hum of the ventilation systems is everywhere aboard a nuclear carrier, a low, omnipresent sound that becomes background within a day of boarding, noticed again only when it changes or stops. Fravor moved through those passageways the way officers move through familiar ships, efficiently, with the attention directed inward toward whatever problem or task was currently occupying the operational mind. The ship itself reduced to the reliable medium through which daily work was done. The Southern California operating area is a large designated expanse of ocean extending roughly westward and southward from the San Diego coastline, curving down along the northern Baja California coast of Mexico. The military has used it for decades as a training zone, both for surface and subsurface naval operations, and for the full range of carrier aviation training activities, low-altitude flight, surface strike exercises, aerial combat training, and the integration drills that bring together the different components of a strike group into a functioning whole. In November 2004, the operating area was as familiar to the Princeton's crew as a frequently traveled road is familiar to someone who drives it every working day, not just known in the abstract, but known in the specific, sensory way that professional familiarity accumulates. The radar operators on the Princeton knew what that stretch of ocean looked like on their screens. They knew the traffic patterns, the seasonal variations, the occasional anomalous seeming contact that resolved on closer inspection into a scheduled commercial flight on an unusual heading, or a military exercise participant whose track had wandered from its filed corridor. They knew what normal looked like out there. They had the library of normal, cataloged over months and years of standing watch in that specific stretch of sea. The water in November in the Southern California operating area runs a particular shade of blue-gray that photographs rarely capture with full accuracy. From altitude, from the cockpit of an aircraft on a clear morning, 15,000 feet above the surface, the ocean at that latitude has a texture that is only partly color. It is also the slow movement of long swells, visible from above as a subtle patterning of light and shadow across the surface, the individual waves too small to distinguish at that height, but their aggregate effect, giving the water a breathing, shifting quality that a flat photograph flattens to nothing. Pilots who have flown training exercises over the Southern California operating area have accumulated that view in their muscle memory alongside the instrument readings and traffic advisories, the water below as a familiar floor, a known reference, the ground out there replaced by the particular gray-blue of the Pacific in November, moving slowly under the aircraft as training miles accumulated into hours and hours accumulated into the total of a career. The USS Princeton occupied her assigned position within the strike group formation with the professional steadiness of a ship that has been doing exactly this for the full length of her operational life. A Ticonderoga-class cruiser operating as the air defense ship of a carrier strike group is responsible for the managed airspace above and around the formation, for tracking everything that flies within sensor range, for identifying it, for determining whether it poses any risk to the group, and for coordinating the response if it does. The AN/SPY-1B radar system that the Princeton carried was among the most capable surface-based air surveillance radars in the American fleet at that time. Its phased array design, using a fixed antenna face rather than a rotating dish, allowed it to track multiple targets simultaneously across a wide volume of sky, updating its picture faster than older rotating antenna systems could manage, resolving the altitude, speed, and heading of contacts with a precision that experienced operators trusted. The Princeton had completed an upgrade to this system before the November 2004 workup, and the upgrade had been tested and verified. The system was performing to specification. The operators had confirmed this in the days since the exercises began. The training schedule for November 2004 was constructed the way all pre-deployment workup schedules are constructed, with an escalating sequence of exercise complexity, beginning with basic unit-level training in the early weeks and building toward integrated exercises that tested the full strike group's ability to operate as a coordinated force. The November 14th date was still some days away when the exercises began. The Nimitz and her escorts moved through their assigned exercise areas with the organized attention of a formation that has learned to function together, each ship maintaining its station, each crew standing its watches, each operational system generating the data and the communications traffic that allow a strike group to present itself as a single, capable entity rather than a collection of independent vessels. The sky above the formation was busy with training flights, Super Hornets, and other aircraft cycling off the Nimitz's deck in the rhythm of carrier flight operations, their tracks logged and coordinated and entirely accounted for in the Princeton's Combat Information Center. The light in the Southern California operating area in early November comes at a low angle in the morning and afternoon hours, and the surface of the sea in that light has a different character than it holds at midday, flatter, more reflective, the swells catching the low sun on their westward faces and going dark on their eastern sides. The whole surface of the ocean becoming a pattern of illumination and shadow that shifts as the sun moves and the swells move, and the angle between them changes. Aircraft on low-altitude training runs in the early morning see this light from close range, the surface rushing past beneath them at whatever altitude the exercise profile demands, the water filling the peripheral vision below the instrument panel. At higher altitudes, the light from the same angle gives the Pacific a pewter quality, gray and blue at once, the horizon a clean line only when the visibility is good and the atmosphere is clear, which in November in that area it often is. The weather during the training period in late October and early November 2004 was described by participants as unremarkable, clear, with moderate seas, the kind of operating conditions that neither favor nor complicate the standard range of carrier aviation exercises. The Black Aces flight schedule during the workup placed their aircraft in the air on the regular rotations that carrier aviation training requires. Two-seat F/A-18Fs turning off the Nimitz's catapults in the early morning launches, recovering in the midday cycle, launching again in the afternoon, recovering at dusk or in the early evening dark. The rhythm of carrier flight operations has an almost mechanical regularity during workup periods, a tempo set by the operational schedule and maintained by the integration of flight deck crew, maintenance crews, air operations, and the pilots and weapons systems officers who fly the aircraft. Fravor flew his share of those rotations as commanding officer of the squadron, accumulating the kind of ordinary training time that builds proficiency and constitutes the substance of pre-deployment preparation. There was nothing in those days before November 14th that distinguished them from any other pre-deployment training evolution he had participated in. The work was familiar, the environment was familiar. The Nimitz and her strike group were doing what the Nimitz and her strike group did. 100 miles southwest of San Diego, the coastline of California is not visible. The land has entirely receded. The hills of the Tijuana Mesa and the Baja California coast to the south are below the horizon. The Pacific is present in all directions, and the formation of the strike group, the carrier herself and her escorts arranged around her in their assigned positions, becomes its own reference point, the only fixed structure in a moving expanse of water. Ships at sea develop their own interior geography to compensate for this, the known positions of compartments and passageways, the watch rotation schedules, the meal times and maintenance periods, and exercise timelines that organize the day into something navigable without external landmarks. The Princeton's crew had their own interior geography of that sort. The operators in the Combat Information Center had the additional geography of their displays, the radar picture, the returns, the tracks, the identifications, the familiar texture of the operating area as it presented itself on their screens. Senior Chief Petty Officers in the United States Navy occupy the rank where institutional knowledge and operational experience converge. They are not officers in the commission sense, but their expertise in the specifics of their ratings, the technical systems, the operational procedures, the accumulated judgment of long practice, gives them a particular authority within the units where they serve. The Operations Specialist rating is focused specifically on the interpretation and management of sensor data, radar returns, electronic warfare inputs, communications traffic, the integration of information from multiple sources into an operational picture that supports command decisions, an operations specialist who had reached senior chief rank in 2004, carried years of experience reading those displays in exactly the kind of environment the Princeton was then operating in. They would have worked across multiple ship types, multiple operating areas, multiple exercise environments, and multiple sensor system generations. They would have accumulated over that time a detailed and reliable internal model of what normal radar returns look like, and, just as importantly, of what anomalous-looking returns almost always resolve into when examined closely enough. The Princeton's radar operators were that kind of experienced. They had been working the Southern California operating area for the duration of the workup. They knew the traffic. They knew the patterns. They knew the seasonal shipping routes, the commercial aviation corridors, the typical altitudes of civilian aircraft and military training aircraft and surface traffic. They knew how weather phenomena could produce spurious returns and how those returns differed in character from genuine aircraft tracks. They knew the behavior of the Aegis system well enough to distinguish a genuine contact from an artifact of the radar processing, and they had confirmed, over the days since the system's upgrade, that the AN/SPY-1B was performing correctly, and that its returns were reliable. They were, in the specific professional sense, exactly the right people to be watching that particular stretch of ocean on those particular days. The formation moved through the Southern California operating area in the first 2 weeks of November with the steady, purposeful quality of a large naval exercise progressing through its scheduled phases. Aircraft launched and recovered. Ships maintained their stations. The exercise evaluators tracked the formation's performance against the certification requirements. Below the flight deck of the Nimitz, in the passageways and berthing areas and mess decks and machinery spaces, the life of 5,000 sailors continued in its dense and ordinary way. The meals, the maintenance, the off-watch recreation, the particular social texture of a large ship at sea, where the same faces repeat in the same spaces over the days and weeks of a deployment cycle. The Pacific to the south and west of San Diego holds its color and its texture through November with a kind of impersonal consistency. The swells come in from the northwest, generated by weather systems far out in the ocean, and they run long and low across the surface of the operating area, giving the water a slow, organized movement that is more felt than seen from the deck of a ship, but clearly visible from altitude. To sky in that latitude in that month is often a pale, high blue in the daytime hours, not the deep blue of the tropics, but a cooler, more silvered blue that gives the horizon a slight haze, even on the clearest days. The light in the morning is clean and direct. The surface of the water in the morning light has a clarity of definition, the wave patterns, the color transitions, the occasional white of a breaking crest that the midday glare reduces to a single bright reflective plane. The Princeton's crew moving through their watches during those days would have seen that sky and that water through the windows and exterior spaces of the ship in the brief moments between their interior duties, the operating area doing what operating areas do, providing the known familiar, weather-given background against which the work of the exercise proceeded, and the operators in the Combat Information Center, seated at their consoles in the dimmed blue-green light of the displays, were watching a stretch of ocean they knew better than most people know, any single patch of the world. The AN/SPY-1B's sweeps moved through their rotation, building the radar picture, resolving the contacts, painting the sky above the operating area in the steady, reliable imagery that the system was built to produce. The returns came in as they had come in every day of the workup. The tracks were logged and identified, the familiar contacts, the commercial aviation traffic at high altitude, the training aircraft cycling from the Nimitz, the surface vessels maintaining their formation positions, move through the display in the patterns that experienced operators recognize without having to think about them. Everything in those days was where it was expected to be. The Princeton's radar operators knew that stretch of ocean, its rhythms, its textures, its typical contents, the full vocabulary of what was supposed to appear on those screens, in the deep practical way that professionals know the specific territory they have worked for the whole of their careers. What that specific knowledge means in the context of what those operators were about to see is simply this. When a contact appears on a screen that a trained operator knows as well as those operators knew that screen, and that contact does not match anything in the operator's library of recognized patterns, the operator does not need to search for a reason to consider it anomalous. The deviation from the known is legible immediately. It is not a question of interpretation. It is a question of recognition. In the days that still remained before November 14th, 2004, the Princeton's Combat Information Center was doing its work in the steady, professional way it had done its work throughout the entire exercise period. The screens cast their pale light. The radar swept its arcs across the Southern California operating area. The operators watched. The ocean below the operating area ran its slow swells beneath the November sky. The strike group held its formation. The Nimitz moved through its routines, its flight deck cycling aircraft, its passageways carrying their ordinary traffic of sailors and officers going about the business of a carrier at sea. All of it. The ship and her escorts, the aircraft and their crews, the radar and its operators, the ocean and the sky above it, was settled into the practiced, competent normality of a military exercise proceeding exactly as it was designed to proceed. The operators in the Combat Information Center knew what normal looked like in that stretch of water, in that season, on those screens. They had built that knowledge over long careers at those consoles, in that specific operating area, watching contacts resolve and familiar patterns repeat. It was the kind of knowledge that does not announce itself or call attention to its own depth. It simply sits, accumulated and available, in the minds of people who have done the same careful, specific work in the same careful, specific place for long enough that the ordinary has become thoroughly, completely known. That familiarity was the ground on which everything else would rest, and it was, in its quiet way, entirely undisturbed, as the first days of November moved through the operating area in their unremarkable sequence, and the strike group continued its exercises, and the screens in the Princeton's Combat Information Center returned their steady, familiar picture of a stretch of Pacific that had not yet offered them anything they did not recognize. Senior Chief Kevin Day was at his console in the Princeton's Combat Information Center when the contact appeared at the top of the vertical scale and was gone from it almost before he had time to register what he was seeing. The AN/SPY-1B Aegis radar system aboard the Princeton was not new technology by November 2004, but it was newly upgraded, recalibrated, tuned, its software current, and Senior Chief Day had spent years learning the particular character of its displays, the way familiar contacts moved through its coverage volume, the signature shapes of commercial airliners descending toward the California coast, the tracks of military training aircraft cycling through the operating area in the predictable arcs of scheduled exercises. He knew what the screen looked like when everything on it made sense. On the morning he described in later interviews, nothing about the contact at the top of the altitude scale made sense at all. It had appeared at approximately 80,000 feet, a dot at the very edge of the system's vertical range, high above the operational ceiling of any conventional military aircraft he had ever worked with, and then it had descended toward the ocean surface in the next radar sweep so rapidly that the two positions, the one at altitude and the one near the sea surface, seemed connected by nothing more than the memory of what he had seen a fraction of a second before. There was no visible trajectory arc, no gradual intermediate positions, no deceleration signature, just two locations separated by a distance that should have taken any known aircraft many minutes to cover, presented to him within the span of a single sweep interval, as though the concept of transit had not applied. The Combat Information Center aboard the Princeton occupied a compartment deep within the ship, its overhead lighting deliberately reduced to preserve the clarity of the display screens. The ambient light in the space during active operations was the light of the screens themselves, a blue-green cast that fell across the faces of the operators and gave the compartment a particular quality, the particular stillness of a room where attention was the primary activity, and where the trained eye had learned to move across multiple displays in a single practice scan without losing track of any of them. Day had worked in spaces like this one for years. He had developed the kind of practiced patience that radar work requires, the ability to sit in that pale light and watch a display for hours without the attention drifting, noting every return, classifying every track, building in the background of his awareness a model of what was normal in a given operating area at a given time of day, so that anything that deviated from that model would register immediately and precisely. That model, built across years of work in the Southern California operating area, was what told him within seconds that the contact at the top of the scale was not something with a conventional explanation. In late October 2004, with the training workup still in its early stages, the Princeton's radar operators were running through the standard monitoring cycles that the exercise required of them. The operating area extended from the waters southwest of San Diego toward the northern Baja California coast, a stretch of open Pacific that Day and his colleagues knew in the way that people who have looked at the same piece of ocean on a radar screen for extended periods come to know it, not just as geography, but as a data environment, a pattern of expected contacts and familiar tracks that formed a kind of background against which anything new would appear with immediate clarity. Commercial traffic maintained predictable corridors. Military training aircraft cycled through their assigned blocks of airspace on schedules that could be anticipated. Surface vessels moved at surface vessel speeds along routes that made sense for surface vessels. None of that was what appeared on the screen that first morning, or on the mornings and afternoons that followed it across the next 2 weeks. The contacts returned. That was the detail that Senior Chief Day returned to consistently in his public accounts of the detection window, not just that an anomalous radar return had appeared once and then been dismissed as an instrument artifact or a weather phenomenon, or any of the other categories of non-event that experienced radar operators learned to recognize and set aside. The contacts came back. They appeared in the same general portion of the operating area, in no pattern that corresponded to a flight schedule or a transit route or a training profile, at intervals that were irregular enough to rule out any routine operational explanation. Day described the objects as returning day after day. He described watching them appear at altitude and descend, and watching them loiter in the lower portions of the airspace in a way that no aircraft performance profile he had ever worked with could account for. An aircraft that descends from 80,000 feet to near sea level altitude in the time between one radar sweep and the next is not performing any maneuver that existing aviation technology makes possible. An object that then remains stationary or near stationary at a low altitude over the open ocean for an extended period while producing no detectable propulsion signature is not behaving like an aircraft. Day knew both of these things. He had the professional background to state them with precision. What he did not have was an explanation. In the Combat Information Center during those days in late October and into early November, the operators did what trained specialists do when sensor data produces results that do not conform to expectation. They checked their equipment. The Aegis system had been recently upgraded, and the initial assumption, the first, most reasonable assumption, was that the anomalous contacts were artifacts of the upgrade, calibration errors in the new software, some interaction between the updated system configuration and the specific electromagnetic environment of the operating area that was producing false returns with the characteristics of fast-moving objects. Day and his colleagues ran diagnostics. They cross-checked the anomalous contacts against secondary sensor systems, any secondary system available to them that could either confirm or rule out the reality of what the Spy 1B was showing. The diagnostics came back clean. The equipment was functioning within normal parameters. The software was performing as designed. The calibration was current and correct, and the contacts continued to appear. There was no alarm in the Combat Information Center during those days, in the sense that there was no elevated urgency, no formal alert status, no command-level emergency response to the anomalous returns. What there was, in Day's account, was a deepening professional puzzlement, the kind that settles into the work when a data set refuses to resolve into any of the categories available to explain it, when the equipment checks out, and the calibration checks out, and the operator's own training checks out, and still the data says something that the data should not be able to say. Day described watching the contacts across those days with the focused attention that his training had given him, and with a growing awareness that nothing in that training was going to provide him with an adequate accounting of what he was looking at. He described the objects as appearing to loiter. That word, loiter, is a specific word in aviation operational context. It means to remain in an area, to hold a position or a general zone, to maintain presence over a location without transiting through it. An aircraft can loiter, a helicopter can loiter. An object that descends from extreme altitude at a rate no known aircraft can achieve, and then remains in the lower airspace without displaying any of the propulsion signatures that would explain how it is staying aloft. That object is not loitering in any sense that the word's operational meaning was designed to cover. Day used the word anyway because it was the closest word in the language of his profession to what he was watching. The compartment had a particular sound during those monitoring sessions, the background noise of the ship's systems running through the bulkheads, the low hum of electronics, the occasional exchange between operators in the clipped professional shorthand of people working alongside each other in focused silence. The display screens cast their pale light. The radar swept its coverage volume and returned its data at intervals measured in seconds, each sweep adding a new layer to the picture of the operating area and either confirming the continued presence of a contact or noting its absence. When the anomalous contacts were present, they sat on the screens with the solidity of real returns, not the faint, marginal quality of a weather artifact or a sea surface clutter return, but the clear, consistent signature of an object actually present in the airspace at the position the system was showing. When they were absent, the operating area looked as it always had, The familiar pattern of traffic and silence and scheduled activity that Day and his colleagues had been building their professional knowledge of for years. And then they would come back. The question of what Senior Chief Day and the other operators did with this information across those 2 weeks is in the way that many operational details from the period are incompletely documented in the public record. What is known is that the Princeton's Combat Information Center did not simply absorb the anomalous contacts and continue as though nothing unusual was occurring. At some point in the detection window, after multiple days of recurring returns in the same general area, after the equipment checks had produced nothing useful, after the contacts had appeared and disappeared and reappeared in a pattern that defied ordinary explanation, the decision was made to take the matter further. The anomalous contacts were reported up through the appropriate operational channels. The question of what to do about an aerial contact that was appearing repeatedly in a defined area of the operating zone and refusing to conform to any known performance profile was eventually answered, at least provisionally, in the way that naval operational culture tends to answer questions of that kind, with the dispatch of aircraft to investigate. The coordination between the Princeton and the Nimitz's Air Operations Center that led to that decision was itself a procedural matter, the kind of inter-ship communication that happens regularly during a carrier strike group exercise. Finishes passing between the cruiser's Combat Information Center and the carrier's air wing operations in the formal, precise language of military coordination. What was unusual about this particular coordination was its subject. The Princeton was not requesting a routine training intercept or a scheduled exercise event. It was asking the air wing to task a section of fighters to go and visually investigate a contact that the Princeton's radar had been tracking on and off for approximately 2 weeks, and that had not been satisfactorily explained by any of the standard analytical tools available to the ship's operators. The request passed through the appropriate channels. The response was affirmative. The task fell to a section of F/A 18F Super Hornets from Strike Fighter Squadron 41, the Black Aces, Commander David Fravor and his wingman, who at the time were conducting routine training work in the operating area on the morning of November 14, 2004. The Southern California operating area in November stretches westward from the coast in light that comes off the water as a kind of flat, diffuse brightness, not the sharp clarity of late spring or summer, but a softer quality of illumination that sits evenly over the surface of the ocean and gives the open water at midday the particular blue-gray of the North Pacific in the lower latitude winter. From altitude, the surface of the ocean in that light appears as a slow movement of large swells, the texture of the water visible as shifting gradations of dark and slightly less dark, the horizon extending far enough in every direction that the curvature of the earth is a faint suggestion at the edge of the visible field. It was in this air, over this water, that the Princeton's radar operators had been watching the anomalous contacts appear for 2 weeks. It was into this air that fighters were now being sent to look at something the sensors had found but had not been able to account for. The contacts during the detection window had appeared at approximately the same general location within the operating area on multiple occasions. Day described them as appearing in a patch of ocean that was unremarkable in every visible sense. No surface activity, no unusual traffic, no feature of the geography that would explain why objects should appear there repeatedly rather than somewhere else in the zone. The operating area was large. The contacts kept returning to roughly the same stretch of water. That consistency, in Day's account, was itself part of what made the detection window so difficult to set aside. A single anomalous radar return can be noise. A single instrument artifact can produce a false contact with unusual characteristics, but a pattern of returns recurring over days in the same general area, with consistent performance characteristics that deviate from known aircraft envelopes in the same ways each time they appear. That pattern requires an explanation of a different kind than the ones that apply to single events. The upgraded AN/SPY-1B system aboard the Princeton had been through its post-installation testing and had been certified operational before the November exercise began. The system represented the current generation of Aegis phased array radar technology in late 2004, a powerful air defense tool designed to track multiple airborne contacts simultaneously across a wide coverage volume, capable of distinguishing targets at long range with high confidence. Day had trained on the system and worked with it long enough to understand its performance characteristics and its failure modes. When a radar system that he understood well, that had checked out clean in every diagnostic run, that was certified as functioning correctly, continued to show him contacts that he could not explain, contacts that had been appearing for 2 weeks over the same patch of ocean, the conclusion he arrived at was not that the system was malfunctioning. The system was working. The contacts were real. The question was what they were. In those days of the detection window, there was a particular quality to the attention that the Combat Information Center's operators gave to the anomalous contacts, a quality that was distinct from the routine monitoring that fills most of the hours of a watch in a space like that one. Routine monitoring is a distributed attention, spread across the whole picture that the sensors are presenting, alert to anything that changes, but not focused on any single element of the display. What the Princeton's operators developed across those 2 weeks, as the contacts kept returning to the same area, was a more specific attentiveness, the kind that forms around a particular data point that has not yet yielded its meaning, the kind that returns to the same position on the screen each time the sweep completes, checking whether the contact is still there, noting its altitude and bearing and the way it moves when it moves. Day described that attentiveness in the language of professional observation. He described watching the contacts with the precision of someone who had committed to understanding what he was looking at, even if the understanding was slow in coming and the available tools were not sufficient to produce it. The contacts that appeared near the ocean surface after the descent from altitude, that Day described as nearly instantaneous in radar terms, did not behave like surface contacts. A surface vessel shows up on radar with a signature that reflects the electromagnetic reality of a large metal object sitting on the water, moving at the speeds that vessels move. The contacts from the detection window at their lower altitudes did not match that signature. They appeared to hold position at altitudes consistent with low-level flight, close to the surface but not on it, and they appeared to do so without the continuous motion that would be expected of an aircraft maintaining lift through aerodynamic means. Day described them as appearing to hold station over the ocean. An aircraft holding station over the ocean at low altitude without forward movement sufficient to generate lift is a helicopter. The contacts did not move like helicopters. They did not produce the radar return characteristics associated with rotary wing aircraft. They held their positions by means that the data did not illuminate. The decision to coordinate with the Nimitz's Air Operations Center was made after the detection window had extended across enough days, and the contacts had returned with enough regularity that the informal professional opinion forming in the Combat Information Center had reached the level of confidence required to act on it. That informal opinion was simply this: Something was in the operating area that was not supposed to be there and was not behaving in a way that any standard reference source could account for. The precise chronology of how that opinion moved from the operators at their consoles to the level of command authority necessary to redirect a section of fighters from their scheduled training mission is not fully documented in the public record. What is documented is the outcome. After 2 weeks of anomalous contacts and no satisfactory explanation, a pair of F/A-18F Super Hornets were tasked to proceed to the area where the contacts had been appearing and to attempt a visual identification of whatever the Princeton's radar had been tracking. Senior Chief Kevin Day has given interviews about this period of the detection window in the years since 2004, speaking about his experience in the way that someone speaks about a professional memory that has not lost its particularity across the years, precise about the data, precise about the behavior of the contacts, precise about the steps the operators took to verify their equipment and rule out instrument error, and precise about the conclusion they arrived at when those steps produced nothing that changed the picture. He described the object's behavior as matching nothing in his operational experience. He described the contacts as the most inexplicable data of his Navy career. He was not speaking in hyperbole. Day had worked with radar systems in naval operational contexts long enough that the phrase most inexplicable data of my career carries the weight of a professional comparison made against a substantial baseline of data that was, in all other cases, eventually explicable. This data was not. He watched it for 2 weeks, and it was not. There is a quality to the kind of puzzlement that accumulates over a sustained period of unexplained observations, a quality different from the sharp puzzlement of a single anomalous event, which can be held at arm's length and assigned to the category of things that will probably be explained shortly. The puzzlement that accumulates across 2 weeks of recurring contacts that appear with the solidity of real radar returns, and then vanish and then reappear, contacts that behave in ways that no available reference frame can account for, contacts that survive every equipment check and every diagnostic run and every attempt at calibration verification. That kind of puzzlement settles into the professional memory differently. It becomes part of how the operator understands the limits of what their instruments and their training have prepared them for. Day carried that understanding with him through the remainder of the exercise and beyond it. He has spoken about it in public settings across the years since. The contacts he tracked in late October and early November 2004 remained, in his account, without explanation, not because the question was not pursued, but because the available answers were not sufficient for what the sensors had found. The operating area looked the same from the surface as it had before the contacts began appearing. The Pacific in November, in that stretch of water southwest of the California coast, is not a place that announces its history. The swells move through, regardless of what the radar operators aboard nearby vessels have been watching. The water holds no mark of the contacts that appeared above it at extreme altitude and descended toward it with a speed that the instruments recorded and the operators noted, and no one could explain. The air over that stretch of ocean is simply air, in the way that it always is, wide and clear on the days when the weather is settled and the training aircraft are cycling through their exercise profiles, and the Combat Information Center aboard the Princeton is fully staffed, and the screens are showing their operators everything that is in the airspace above a well-known stretch of the Pacific. Blee, what was in the airspace above it during those 2 weeks was, in Day's account, something the operators had not seen before and were not given tools adequate to understand after. The November 14th decision to redirect a training section toward the coordinates where the contacts had been appearing was, in operational terms, a straightforward response to a straightforward problem. Something was producing anomalous radar contacts in a defined area of a military operating zone. The appropriate response, having exhausted the available sensor-based methods of investigation, was to send aircraft to look. The decision carried no particular weight beyond its immediate operational logic. The section that was tasked, 2F/A, 18F Super Hornets from the Black Aces, their pilots and weapons systems officers, briefed on the general parameters of what the Princeton had been tracking, departed on what appeared to be a clear November morning over open water toward a coordinate in the Southern California operating area where the radar had been showing something unusual for the better part of 2 weeks. The morning was clear. The water was the particular blue-gray of the North Pacific in the lower latitudes of late autumn. The coordinate was approximately 100 miles southwest of San Diego, over open ocean, in a stretch of water that the Princeton's radar operators knew as well as any stretch of ocean they had ever worked. And they knew it well enough to know what they expected to find at that coordinate, which was nothing visible. The contacts appeared on radar. They had not, in 2 weeks of repeated appearance, been seen by anyone. The dispatch of fighters to the area where they had been appearing was an act of professional investigation, carried out with the care and precision that naval aviation brings to any tasked mission. It was also an acknowledgement that the sensors alone had not produced an answer, and that a human eye carried to the location by an F/A-18F Super Hornet on a clear November morning might find something the sensors had not been able to adequately characterize. The Princeton's Combat Information Center continued monitoring as the section departed for the coordinate. The screen showed the operating area as it had appeared on dozens of mornings of this training period, the familiar distribution of contacts in their familiar areas, the tracks of the task section moving toward the designated position in the northwest quadrant of the operating zone, the rest of the airspace holding its ordinary shape. The radar operators at their consoles in the blue-green light of the CIC had spent 2 weeks watching a portion of that airspace produce contacts they could not account for. They understood, in the professional way that people understand things their instruments have taught them, that something had been present in that area on a persistent basis, something that the best radar system available to the strike group had tracked and recorded and failed to classify. Now fighters were going to look. The ocean held its own counsel about what was above it, as it always does, wide and dark and indifferent to the questions forming in the rooms of the ships moving slowly across its surface, indifferent to the radar sweeps crossing and recrossing its airspace, indifferent to the particular professional puzzlement of the trained operators who had been sitting in the pale blue-green light of the Combat Information Center and watching something appear and disappear above it for 2 weeks without finding a name for what it was. A fighter aircraft was now being redirected toward a coordinate on that water. The November morning was clear above it, and the air was still, and the swells moved through the deep blue of the open Pacific as they always do, without marking what had been present in the air above them, or what was about to arrive there to look. The object was white. That was the first thing. White and smooth and oblong against the blue of the Pacific, hovering at low altitude above the water, approximately 100 miles southwest of San Diego, on the morning of November 14th, 2004, visible through the canopy of Commander David Fravor's F/A 18F Super Hornet as he came down from altitude toward the intercept coordinate. No wings, no tail surfaces, no exhaust plume trailing behind it, no visible means of generating lift, no markings of any kind on its smooth exterior. It was approximately 40 feet in length, Fravor would later say, roughly the size of a large aircraft, but shaped like nothing he had encountered in his career. He described it as resembling a tic-tac candy, oblong, rounded at both ends, featureless along its full length, white in the clear November light. It sat above the water without moving, still and quiet, and simply there. Fravor had been flying for 17 years at that point. He had logged thousands of hours in naval aircraft. He had accumulated the kind of professional experience that makes a pilot instinctively categorize what he sees in the sky, that is a commercial airliner at cruise altitude, that is a training aircraft in its characteristic pattern, that is a weather balloon drifting on the wind, the identification happening before it is consciously processed, built into the way a trained aviator reads the airspace around him. What he saw through the canopy of his aircraft that morning did not resolve into any category. It hovered. It did not drift the way a balloon drifts, carried gently along by the prevailing winds. It did not circle the way an aircraft circles in a holding pattern. It simply remained where it was, at low altitude above the Pacific, white and still against the darker water below it. His wingman that morning was Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich, flying her own F/A-18F in a two-section formation. She saw it too, from her aircraft, from her angle of approach. At the same moment that Fravor acquired it visually, Dietrich observed the same white oblong shape above the water. She would describe it years later in her own words, a white oblong object, no visible wings, no visible propulsion, no contrail, no features that aligned with any aircraft she had trained against or operated alongside. The two of them were approaching the same thing from different positions in the sky, and what they each saw was consistent with what the other reported. The object was there. It was approximately 40 feet long. It was white. It was smooth. It was not moving. What Fravor noticed next, looking down from his altitude at the water below the object, was the disturbance on the surface. The Pacific in that area was moving the way open ocean moves in November. Long, slow swells, the water textured and dark blue-gray, the surface rolling in the characteristic patterns of deep water in the open operating area. But in one specific area directly beneath where the object hovered, the water was different. It was churning, frothing, Fravor would say, a roughly oval patch of agitated whitewater, sitting against the calmer surface around it, visibly distinct from above, approximately the footprint of a Boeing 737. The foam was white and rough, the surface broken and turbulent in a way that suggested something was disturbing the water from below or above it, and there was nothing visible, no submarine surfacing, no surface vessel of any kind, no equipment or structure that accounted for the disturbance. The water beneath the object was simply churning in that specific oval against the otherwise unremarkable surface of the sea. Fravor would note later that the disturbance looked as though something had recently been there, or was still there, beneath the surface, though nothing was visible to explain it. The oval of whitewater sat undisturbed in its churning, below a smooth white object that hovered above it without generating any visible downwash, any thermal plume, any wash of air or exhaust that would itself explain the turbulence below. The two elements, the hovering object and the churning water beneath it, occupied the same frame of visual reference without obviously connecting to each other. The water moved, the object did not, and from altitude, looking down through the clear November air at both of them together, the The scene held its own particular and unaccounted for geometry. He began his descent. That was the next step. Bring the aircraft down from altitude, close the distance, get a better look at the object from a nearer position. Fravor rolled into the descent and started toward it. The object, which had not moved while he observed it from above, now moved. It ascended. It rose from its position near the sea surface toward him as he descended toward it, the two of them closing the distance between them from opposite directions, his Super Hornet angling down, the white oblong shape rising up to meet him. Fravor described this as a mirroring motion. The object appeared to track his movement and respond to it, not by fleeing or by holding its position, but by moving toward him in a way that matched his own direction of travel. He came down, it came up, the distance between them closed. He executed a circular pattern, a maneuver designed to gain a positional advantage, to get above and behind the object, to put his aircraft in a relationship to the contact that would give him a clearer observation angle and better situational awareness of its behavior. The object responded to this as well, as Fravor banked and began the circular arc, the white shape oriented toward him again, tracking his new position, appearing to maintain its awareness of where his aircraft was and adjusting its own attitude and bearing accordingly. It did not simply sit in space while he maneuvered around it. It turned toward him. It held its attention, if that word can be applied to an object with no visible crew compartment, no windows, no surfaces that suggested an interior, on the aircraft attempting to circle it. The exchange lasted for several minutes, Fravor descending, the object ascending, Fravor banking into a circle, the object tracking his position. In those minutes, he was close enough to confirm what he had seen from altitude. No wings, no rotors, no canards, no tail assembly, no vertical stabilizer, no horizontal stabilizer, no engine nacelles, no exhaust ports, no landing gear in a deployed or retracted configuration, no visible joints or seams that suggested panels or hatches, no national markings or serial numbers, no external fuel tanks, no hardpoints for weapons or equipment. A smooth white oblong, rounded at both ends, approximately 40 feet long, operating in the airspace above the Southern California operating area and responding to the presence of an F/A-18F Super Hornet, with what appeared from the cockpit of that aircraft to be deliberate and reactive motion. Fravor broke the circle and attempted to close directly on the object. The object at this point departed. That was the word he would use later. Departed, because what happened next did not resolve into any more precise verb without introducing information that the observation itself did not establish. One moment the object was there, present in his visual field, white against the sky and the surface of the Pacific below, and then it was not there. It did not accelerate in the way a conventional aircraft accelerates, a jet engine producing thrust, the aircraft gaining speed over a perceptible interval, the contrail extending behind it as it moves away. It did not climb in the way a conventional aircraft climbs, banking upward with a visible angle of ascent. It simply was present, and then was absent. The air where it had been was undisturbed. There was no contrail. There was no sonic boom, though the object, if it had crossed the sound barrier in a conventional sense, would have generated one. There was no thermal bloom in the infrared spectrum, no wash of heat left behind by an engine or a propulsion system of any kind. The sky was simply clear where the object had been, and the Pacific continued its slow movement below, and the oval of churning water, Fravor noted later, appeared to have quieted as well. The total elapsed time of the visual encounter was approximately 5 minutes, In those 5 minutes, Fravor had observed an unidentified object at low altitude above the Pacific, watched it respond to his descent with an ascending motion that appeared to mirror his own, attempted a circular maneuver to gain a positional advantage, and found the object tracking his position in response, and then watched it leave the area in a manner that produced none of the observable signatures, contrail, sonic event, thermal residue that a conventional departure at speed would generate. He was a commanding officer with 17 years of naval aviation experience. He had trained against adversarial aircraft, had studied the performance envelopes of foreign military systems, had operated in exercises designed to test his recognition of unconventional threats. What he had observed, he said afterward, matched none of that. He returned to the Nimitz. The debrief would come later, the accounts filed and the conversations had with the crew of the Princeton and with his chain of command. But in the immediate period after landing, the encounter sat with him as a specific and precise set of observations. White, smooth, oblong, approximately 40 feet, no visible propulsion, responsive to his movements, departed without a signature. He would carry those specifics consistently across the years that followed. The details did not change between the initial debrief in 2004 and his congressional testimony nearly 2 decades later. The object he described in each successive account was the same object, the same shape, the same behavior, the same departure, and the consistency of those details across the full span of his testimony is itself a feature of the record worth holding quietly for a moment. There is a particular quality to a first-person account given by someone who has had years to examine their own memory for errors, years in which they have been questioned and cross-examined and pressed for alternative explanations, and who arrives at each new telling with the same specific set of details intact. Fravor's account has that quality. The white oblong shape above the Pacific, the churning water beneath it, the mirroring ascent as he descended, the object tracking him as he circled, the departure without a signature. These details have been offered in pilot debrief, in media interview, in closed congressional session, in open congressional session, across a span of nearly 20 years, and they have not shifted in their particulars. They remain the same clear morning above the same stretch of ocean, with the same white shape, doing the same things before leaving, in the same untraceable way. Dietrich's account runs parallel to his. She observed the object from her own aircraft, from her own angle, and what she reported was consistent with what Fravor reported. A white oblong, without visible propulsion, present above the Pacific and then gone. Her corroboration was independent. She filed her own account, formed her own recollections, and the consistency between the two descriptions, offered by 2 pilots who were in different positions in the sky during the encounter, gives the visual record of that morning a structural solidity that a single witness account would not carry. 2 people, 2 aircraft, 2 separate viewing angles, 2 independently filed accounts, arriving at the same basic description of the same basic object behaving in the same basic way. The object, wherever it went, arrived somewhere. The Princeton's AN/SPY-1B Aegis radar, the same system whose operators had been watching anomalous contacts in the operating area for the preceding days, detected a contact at a coordinate known among the aircrew as the Cat Point, the prearranged combat air patrol position, approximately 60 miles from where Fravor had watched the object disappear. The contact appeared at that coordinate shortly after the object vanished from Fravor's visual field, 60 miles in the interval between one moment and the next. No observed transit, no tracked trajectory on the radar display, simply absent from one location and present at another. The Princeton's operators noted the contact and its position. It matched, in the characteristics of its radar return, the contacts they had been tracking. It sat at the cap point quietly, as though it had simply chosen to be there, at a coordinate that would have been known from standard military communications traffic between the Nimitz and the Princeton. Fravor would note later, with the measured understatement of someone who has thought carefully about what he is claiming, that the object's apparent knowledge of the CAP point coordinate, a position derived from classified communications between ships and aircraft in the exercise, was one of the details of the encounter that he found most difficult to account for. He did not advance a specific explanation for it. He described what he observed. The object was at the intercept coordinate. It departed without a signature, and it subsequently appeared at the cap point 60 miles away. The interval between those two events, if the contact on the Princeton's radar was the same object, implied a transit speed that exceeded any propulsion system he was aware of. He stated this plainly, without embellishment, as a description of the geometry of the events as he understood them. The November morning off the Southern California coast was clear. The operating area extended westward from the coast in deep blue water, the surface textured with long Pacific swells, the horizon clean and flat in every direction from altitude. Fravor would have had visibility measured in tens of miles from his position in the sky, the kind of visibility that makes it possible to see a weather event 40 miles away, to pick out the white of breaking waves at a considerable distance, to acquire a surface vessel by its wake, long before its hull is clearly distinguishable. In that kind of visibility, in those conditions, on that morning, what he found at the intercept coordinate was a white oblong shape hovering above the water with nothing below it and nothing around it, and no characteristics that placed it in any category of object he had been trained to identify. There is a way of considering a first-person account like this one that involves measuring it against what the observer might have been expected to see, given the conditions and their experience. Fravor had the visual acuity and the trained identification skills of a senior naval aviator. He was operating in excellent visibility at moderate altitude. He was close enough to the object during the encounter to confirm the absence of specific features, wings, rotors, exhaust systems, markings that would normally be visible at that range on any known aircraft. He was not reporting a distant light or a brief glimpse or a contact seen through poor visibility. He was reporting an object he had studied from multiple angles over several minutes at a range that should have made its identifying features clearly visible, and what he found was the consistent absence of any such features. The churning water on the surface stayed with him too. He described it specifically, the roughly oval patch of agitated whitewater, approximately the footprint of a Boeing 737, directly beneath where the object hovered. There was no surface vessel visible in the area. The operating zone was familiar, and its surface traffic was known and accounted for. There was no submarine surfacing or having recently surfaced in that position. The water was simply disturbed in that specific location, in that specific shape, beneath an object that was not generating any visible downwash or propulsion output that would account for the disturbance. Fravor observed both, the hovering object and the churning water, and described them as two elements of the same scene whose relationship to each other he could not account for, though they clearly occupied the same spatial frame and the same moment. He had never seen anything like it. He said so plainly in the debrief, and he has said so plainly in every account since. That statement, spoken by someone with 17 years of naval aviation experience, with thousands of flight hours, with familiarity with the performance envelopes of both U.S. and foreign military aircraft, with access to briefings on classified programs that a civilian observer would not have, carries a specific weight that is worth considering at its own pace. It is not the statement of someone who has not seen much. It is the statement of someone who has seen a great deal and encountered, on the morning of November 14th, 2004, something that did not correspond to any of it. The object's behavior during the encounter, the ascending response to his descent, the tracking of his circular maneuver has been described by aviation analysts in the years since as suggesting either reactive guidance of some kind or coincidental motion that appeared reactive from Fravor's perspective. Both interpretations have been offered. Fravor himself has said that what he observed appeared deliberate, appeared responsive, appeared to demonstrate an awareness of his aircraft's position and an adjustment to it. He held to that characterization consistently. Whether the motion was guided by something aboard the object, or whether it was the product of some other mechanism, or whether it presented as reactive without being so, is a question the account alone does not resolve. Fravor described what he saw. The description is precise. The explanation remains open. The 5 minutes of the encounter passed in the specific compressed way that time passes during an unusual event, slowly in memory, quickly in duration, with a clarity of detail that suggests the mind recording it was working at a particular intensity. Fravor's memory of those 5 minutes is granular. He remembered the white of the object's surface against the blue of the sky. He remembered the stillness of the object before it responded to his descent. He remembered the way it rose toward him, not in a lurch, not in a sudden movement, but in a smooth and controlled ascent that matched his own descent in its quality of motion. He remembered the circular pattern he flew and the way the object held its bearing toward him as he completed the arc. He remembered the moment it was gone, and the clarity of the sky where it had been, and the undisturbed air through which his aircraft continued to travel. These are not the memories of a frightened man. They are the memories of a trained observer who encountered something he could not account for and spent the minutes of the encounter doing exactly what his training directed him to do: close the distance, observe carefully, attempt to gain a positional advantage, note the specific details of what he was seeing. He flew toward the thing, he circled it, he tried to get above it. He was operating in the register of professional procedure throughout the encounter, and what he took away from it was a precise and detailed set of observations that have not been satisfactorily matched to any known object or phenomenon. The Pacific was wide and quiet beyond the intercept coordinate. The strike group continued its operations. The Nimitz moved through its routines, and somewhere in the operating area, at a point on the radar display 60 miles from where Fravor had last seen the white oblong shape, the Princeton's operators were watching a contact that had arrived without transit, at a coordinate that should have required knowledge the object should not have had, sitting on their screen with the same characteristics as the contacts they had been watching for the preceding days: the white shape above the water, the churning ocean beneath it, the ascent that mirrored his descent, the circular arc, and the object holding its bearing toward him, through it, the clear air where the object had been, the contact at the CAP point, 60 miles away, waiting quietly on the screen. Those are the documented elements of the November 14th encounter as Fravor and Dietrich reported them, not elaborated, not interpreted, but present in the record in the specific form that two trained military aviators gave them, across accounts spanning nearly 2 decades. The details persist, the way details persist when they correspond to something real, unchanged from telling to telling, specific in their particulars, clear in the November light above the Pacific and unresolved in every place that matters. Fravor has described the encounter in various interviews and in his congressional testimony as the most significant thing he observed in his naval career. He did not frame this as distressing, or as a claim about what the object was, or as a statement about the nature of the phenomenon. He framed it as a simple matter of scale, that what he saw above the Pacific on that morning, in those 5 minutes, was the most anomalous thing he had encountered in 17 years of professional aviation, and that no explanation offered to him since, no classified program identified, no atmospheric phenomenon proposed, no hardware system described, had accounted for what he observed. The record of his testimony holds that statement. It has been made in closed session and in open session. It is part of the formal congressional record of the United States. And it sits there with the same quiet and particular weight as the object itself sat above the Pacific, present, documented, and not yet explained. The clear November air above the operating area, the white shape, smooth and rounded, hovering at low altitude above the churning oval of water, an F/A 18F Super Hornet, banking toward it from altitude, its pilot watching it rise to meet him, the exchange of positions, descent and ascent, circle and orient, playing out over 5 minutes in the wide blue sky southwest of San Diego, and then the object gone, the air undisturbed, the ocean continuing its slow textured movement below, and then, on a radar display aboard the USS Princeton, a contact appearing at a coordinate 60 miles away, a single return on the screen, quiet and still, at a position no observed transit should have made possible, the contact sitting there, the operators watching it, the November morning continuing around them, bright and open and carrying, somewhere inside it, something that the record has not yet resolved. Lieutenant Commander Jim Slight's F/A-18F Super Hornet arrived at the Combat Air Patrol coordinate at low altitude over the Pacific on the same clear November morning, with the ocean stretching in every direction below him and the sky above holding that particular shade of pale blue that belongs to the Southern California coast in autumn. His weapons systems officer reached forward to the targeting pod controls. The AN/Slant AAQ-28 Lightning pod mounted beneath the aircraft's fuselage began its acquisition scan, its sensor aperture sweeping the airspace ahead, its inertial tracking system already compensating for the aircraft's own movement through the air. And there, against the cooler background of the upper atmosphere, the pod found something warm, a small return, oblong. Hovering in the sky ahead at a distance, the system began, quietly, to measure. The listening pod was not a simple camera. It was a precision targeting instrument built for acquiring and holding targets under conditions that challenged human eyesight: low light, high altitude, long distance, rapid aircraft movement, and it processed what it saw in the infrared spectrum, reading heat rather than light. What it saw that morning registered as a pale shape against a gray background. It held that shape in its tracking reticle, and Slight's weapons systems officer, seated in the rear cockpit with the targeting display in front of him, began talking through what he was seeing in the measured, unhurried register of an aircrew member narrating a sensor track. That conversation was being recorded. The aircraft systems captured the audio alongside the listening pod's visual output, the two streams of data encoding themselves onto the same piece of media that would, years later, become one of the most examined and debated short recordings in the public history of unidentified aerial phenomena. The footage would come to be known as the FLIR-1 video, named for the forward-looking infrared sensor technology at its origin, and it would run in its publicly released form for approximately 1 minute and 16 seconds. 1 minute and 16 seconds is not very long. It is long enough to watch the oblong return hold its position against the sky background for several seconds, to watch the targeting reticle track it as the aircraft maneuvers, to hear the weapons systems officer's voice narrating what the pod is seeing in real time. It is long enough to hear the moment the return begins to move, or appears to move, and to hear the aircrew's commentary shift and register as that movement becomes the main event in the sensor display. 1 minute and 16 seconds of infrared imagery captured over the Pacific on a clear November morning by 2 trained naval aviators using calibrated equipment aboard a military aircraft. What the footage shows in its first seconds is a pale oblong shape centered in the sensor's field of view. The background is the gray-white of the infrared sky, cooler air, rendered pale by the sensor's heat-reading process, the upper atmosphere giving the display its characteristic washed-out quality. The shape itself is warmer than the background, not dramatically warmer, not the kind of thermal signature that a conventional jet engine produces, no bloom of heat at any point that would correspond to an exhaust nozzle. No thermal gradient spreading backward from propulsion sources in the way any aircraft in the Lightning pod's operational history would have produced. The warmth is distributed across the shape in a way that aviation and infrared experts who later examined the footage noted was inconsistent with what they would expect from a powered conventional aircraft. The targeting reticle holds the shape. The aircraft banks. The pod's inertial tracking system compensates, working to maintain the lock as the aircraft's own movement through the air shifts the sensor's pointing direction. This is what the Lightning system was designed to do, to maintain a fix on a target through the maneuvers of the aircraft carrying it, to isolate the sensor's field of view from the aircraft's own motion, so that what the targeting officer sees on his display is as stable a picture as the system can provide. For several seconds, it does exactly that. The shape stays in the reticle. The gray background moves slightly as the aircraft banks. The oblong return holds, and then the return moves, or appears to. This is the point at which the footage's documented technical debate begins, and it is worth holding that debate with some care, because it is a genuine one, not an attempt to dismiss what the footage shows, but an honest engagement with what the sensor system was doing at the moment the movement appeared. Mick West, an analyst and writer, whose work on UAP footage had become a reference point in public discussions of such recordings, by the time the FLIR 1 video reached wide attention, examined the footage in detail and proposed that the apparent movement of the infrared return in the clip's final seconds was not entirely, or perhaps not at all, physical movement of the object itself through the airspace. His analysis centered on the Lightning pod's gimbal system, the mechanical articulation that allowed the pod's sensor aperture to point in directions other than straight ahead of the aircraft. The gimbal system had a finite range of motion. When the aircraft banked in one direction and the object being tracked was already at an angle to the aircraft's flight path, the pod's mechanical limits could be reached, and at that moment, the pod would lose its hold on the target and begin to drift, its sensor swinging in the direction the aircraft's motion was carrying it rather than continuing to track the object. The apparent rush of movement visible at the end of the footage in West's reading was the pod reaching that mechanical limit and the sensor's field of view sweeping across the sky as the gimbal hit its stop. This analysis was detailed and technically grounded. It was also not universally accepted. Other analysts, including people with backgrounds in military targeting systems and infrared sensor operation, argued that the object's movement in the footage could not be entirely accounted for by pod gimbal behavior, that the return's trajectory and the timing of its departure from the frame were not fully consistent with a simple mechanical artifact of the sensor's range of motion. The debate sat, and continues to sit, in a space that is genuinely unresolved. Both interpretive positions have technical support. Neither has been established as the definitive account of what the footage shows. This is the condition in which the FLIR 1 footage lives, examined, argued over, analyzed by people with credentials on both sides of the question, and not yet brought to a point of explanatory rest. What can be said with confidence is that the footage is real, meaning it is what it purports to be, a recording made by U.S. Navy aircrew using a military targeting pod during an actual sortie. What cannot be said with the same confidence is precisely what the infrared return represents, or precisely what accounts for its apparent behavior in the clip's final seconds. The footage also had a documentary life, entirely separate from its contents, the story of how it moved from a recording aboard a Navy aircraft in November 2004 to a file on a server accessible to anyone with an internet connection in December 2017, is itself a story of institutions, individuals, and decisions made at a distance from the Pacific Ocean where the recording was made. In the years following the Nimitz encounter, the FLIR 1 footage, along with other recordings from related incidents, existed within the official records of the U.S. military. It was not publicly available. There is no documented public awareness of it during the decade that followed the event. It circulated within the community of people who knew about the Nimitz incident, which was a community small enough to keep the footage from reaching wider attention for more than a decade after it was recorded. Luis Elizondo was a former official of the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. He had been associated with a government program, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, sometimes referred to by its acronym, whose existence was itself not publicly known until December 2017. The program, according to reporting at the time of its public disclosure, had been operating within the Defense Department for several years, funded in part through the efforts of Senator Harry Reid, and had been tasked with investigating UAP incidents involving military personnel. The FLIR 1 footage was among the materials the program had examined. Elizondo resigned from the Defense Department in October 2017, and by December of that year, he was involved in efforts to bring certain materials, including the FLIR 1 video, into public view. To the Stars Academy of Arts and Science was an organization founded in part by musician Tom DeLonge, which had assembled a team of former government and intelligence officials with backgrounds in areas relevant to UAP research. Elizondo joined the organization after his resignation, and it was through the coordination of To the Stars Academy that the FLIR 1 footage, along with two other clips designated Gimbal and Go Fast, was released to the public in December 2017, on the same day that a New York Times investigative article appeared describing the existence of the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program and its connection to the Nimitz encounter. The New York Times article was co-authored by Helene Cooper, Ralph Blumenthal, and Leslie Keene. It described the program, named Elizondo as a former official, and made the Nimitz encounter and the FLIR 1 footage part of the public record in a way they had not been before. The footage accompanied the article, available to be played by anyone who read the piece. The UN classified marking was visible in the corner of the frame. The cockpit audio was audible. The pale oblong return drifted in the center of the display, and then moved, and then was gone. The article's publication produced a significant public response. The footage was viewed by large numbers of people in the hours and days following its release, discussed on news programs, examined on blogs and forums, shared on social media. The reaction ranged across the full spectrum that tends to greet UAP-related disclosures. Some people treated the footage as unambiguous evidence of something extraordinary. Some treated it as a simple case of sensor artifact or misidentification, and a wide range of positions occupied the space between those two poles. The debate about the footage's contents and its implications expanded rapidly as more people with relevant technical backgrounds encountered it and offered their analyses. But the release in December 2017 was, in a documentary sense, only the beginning of the footage's official life. The question of what the U.S. government itself would say about the FLIR 1 video remained open until April 2020. In April 2020, the United States Department of Defense released an official statement. The statement confirmed that the three videos, FLIR 1, Gimbal, and Go Fast, were authentic recordings made by U.S. Navy aircrew. Oceanized the phenomena depicted in the videos as unidentified aerial phenomena. It stated that the videos had been released in order to clear up any public misperceptions about whether the footage was real. The Department of Defense's position, as of April 2020, was that the videos were what they appeared to be, genuine recordings from military aircraft, and that what they depicted remained, in the official record, unidentified. This designation, unidentified aerial phenomena, carried no interpretive conclusion. It did not endorse any explanation for what the footage showed. It did not suggest that the objects depicted were of any particular origin or nature. It simply acknowledged that the footage was real and that what it recorded had not been identified. The Pentagon's statement did not explain the FLIR 1 footage. It confirmed the footage's existence and authenticity, placed it in the official record with a formal designation, and left its contents open. The listening pod that recorded the footage was itself an instrument of considerable sophistication. The ANAAQ-28 variant had been in service with the U.S. Navy since the early 2000s, and it had been designed to operate in exactly the conditions present during the November 14th sortie: clear sky, stable atmosphere, targeting of aerial objects at a range appropriate to the aircraft's engagement envelope. It was not a prototype or an experimental system. It was a fielded piece of military equipment operated by trained personnel, and the data it produced was the kind of data the Navy trusted for targeting decisions in actual combat operations. The footage it produced on that November morning was not the output of a malfunctioning instrument or an improperly calibrated system. The infrared return it tracked was there. The recording of what the pod saw is real. There is a quality to the footage, when it is watched with some care, that is worth sitting with for a moment. Not the drama of the object's departure from the frame, but the earlier portion, the steadier part, when the targeting reticle holds the oblong shape against the gray infrared sky, and the pod's tracking system maintains its lock. In those seconds, the return just sits there. It is not moving dramatically. It is not performing anything. It is simply present, a warm, featureless shape, roughly oblong, held in the center of the sensor's field of view, while the aircraft that is recording it moves through the air around it. There is something almost ordinary about those seconds, in the footage's own visual logic, in the way the targeting system treats the return as a target to be held and tracked, rather than an impossibility to be responded to. The system does what it does. The return is there. The reticle holds it. Slight's weapons systems officer narrates in the flat, efficient language of a man doing his job. His voice is audible in the released footage, measured, descriptive, tracking the display in front of him, the way a trained operator tracks anything he is tasked to observe. He notes the return. He notes its position. He notes when it moves. He does not perform surprise. He describes. This quality of the audio is part of what has made the footage significant to people who study such recordings, not because the weapons systems officer's calm is evidence of anything in particular, but because it is the sound of a professional describing a sensor track in real time, which is exactly what he was doing. The cockpit environment of an F/A-18F Super Hornet during a targeting pod operation is not a still or quiet space. The aircraft is moving, systems are running. The weapons systems officer in the rear seat is working the controls, managing the pod's pointing, interpreting the display, talking through what he sees. The footage captures some of this ambient reality. The audio is not clean. The recording is not studio quality. The display shows the slight jitter and tracking compensation that are the normal signatures of a targeting pod working as designed. None of this is what a fabricated or staged recording would look like. It looks like what it is, a real system recording a real target operated by a real person on a real aircraft over the Pacific Ocean on a clear morning in November 2004. The question the footage leaves open, the question it has always left open, from the moment's slight return to the Nimitz with the recording, is what the return was. Not whether the recording is genuine, not whether the listening system was functioning correctly, not whether the aircrew who operated it were competent and honest. Those questions have answers that the record supports clearly. The question that does not have an established answer is what produced the infrared return that the pod tracked for 1 minute and 16 seconds before losing it. That question was open in November 2004. It was open in December 2017 when the footage was published. It was open in April 2020 when the Pentagon confirmed the footage's authenticity. It remains open now. Aviation analysts who have worked with infrared targeting systems professionally have noted specific features of the FLIR-1 return that resist straightforward conventional explanation. The absence of a thermal bloom at the locations where a jet engine's exhaust would appear on an infrared display is one such feature. A conventional aircraft, at any altitude and in any atmospheric condition, produces a recognizable heat signature from its propulsion system that the listening pod would have rendered visibly. The return in the FLIR-1 footage does not show this. It shows a distributed warmth across the oblong shape without the concentrated thermal sources that propulsion would produce. This observation does not establish what the object was. It simply notes a characteristic of the infrared data that has not been easily accounted for. The altitude of the object at the time of the recording, the precise conditions of the pod's operation, the aircraft's flight path and bank angle during the recording window. All of these are details that have been part of the technical discussion surrounding the footage in the years since its release. Some of those details support interpretations closer to West's gimbal artifact analysis. Others resist that account. The technical literature on the footage, if one were to call it that, the blog posts and journal articles and public analyses and responses to those analyses, fills a considerable space and does not converge on a single conclusion. This is the situation the footage inhabits: genuine, officially acknowledged, technically examined, and unresolved. Not unresolved in the sense of a mystery waiting for one more piece of evidence to fall into place, and necessarily, but unresolved in the more fundamental sense of a piece of recorded data that has been examined by people with relevant expertise and that has not yet been brought to a point of established explanation. The people who have looked most carefully at it do not agree on what they see. There is something in this that is worth sitting with on its own terms, separate from any questions about what the footage might imply about the nature of the object it records, or about the broader significance of the Nimitz encounter as a whole. The footage exists as an artifact, 1 minute and 16 seconds of infrared imagery captured on a clear morning over the Pacific by equipment and personnel whose credibility is not in serious question. It entered the public record in December 2017. It entered the official record, formally, with a designation, in April 2020, and it sits there now in both records simultaneously, available to anyone who wants to examine it. The New York Times article that accompanied the footage's release in December 2017 placed it in a journalistic context that also helped establish its seriousness as a topic for public discussion. Helene Cooper was a veteran defense correspondent. Ralph Blumenthal had spent decades covering stories that required both careful sourcing and willingness to pursue material that other outlets had not yet examined. Leslie Keene had written extensively on UAP topics before this article, with a rigor that had set her work apart in a field that often lacked it. The three of them together produced a piece of reporting that met the institutional standards of one of the most scrutinized publications in American journalism. The article was not credulous. It presented what was documented, what former officials said, and what the footage showed. It noted what was unknown. It did not speculate beyond what the record supported. The combination of those three journalists, that outlet, that footage, and that date, December 2017, produced something that changed the public context for discussions of UAP in a way that persisted. Before December 2017, UAP topics had a particular place in public discourse, widely regarded as fringe, associated with tabloid presentation and unreliable sourcing, not taken seriously as subjects for mainstream institutional attention. After December 2017, that was no longer entirely the case. The footage was out. The program's existence had been confirmed. Named officials had spoken on the record. And the footage was real. The Pentagon would make that explicit a few years later. But even before the April 2020 statement, the provenance of the FLIR 1 video was not seriously disputed by anyone with knowledge of how it had been produced. The aircraft that recorded it had returned to the Nimitz on a November morning in 2004. The ship had continued its training evolution. The recording had entered the official records. And for 13 years, it had sat there, not entirely unknown within the institutions that had produced it, but not part of the public world. The lightning pod's data, the weapons systems officer's voice, the pale oblong return drifting in the gray infrared sky, all of it in storage somewhere in the official record, waiting. The waiting ended in December 2017, and what emerged from it was exactly what had gone in: 1 minute and 16 seconds of real footage, of a real return, tracked by real equipment, accompanied by the real voice of a real naval aviator describing what his sensor was showing him. Nothing had changed in the footage itself. During the 13 years it had not been seen. The infrared return was where it had always been in the recording, drifting in the gray sky, holding in the targeting reticle, and then departing in whatever direction, by whatever mechanism, from the frame. When the footage is played now, it ends the same way it always has. The oblong return drifts, the reticle follows, the aircraft banks, the targeting system pushes against the limits of what it can do, and then the return is gone from the display, the gray-white of the infrared sky filling the frame where the shape had been, the targeting reticle still centered on the empty space it occupied, the weapons systems officer's voice noting, in the measured tone of a professional describing a sensor track, that he has lost the contact, The April 2020 statement from the Department of Defense placed that moment, the moment of loss of contact on the FLIR 1 display, into the official record of unidentified aerial phenomena. The footage that ended with an empty gray infrared sky was, as of that statement, formally part of the documented record of things the U.S. government has encountered and cannot account for, not proven to be extraordinary, not dismissed as ordinary, simply documented, designated, and held in the official record in the category of phenomena that have not yet been satisfactorily explained. 1 minute and 16 seconds. A pale oblong shape in an infrared sky over the Pacific Ocean, tracked by a Navy targeting pod on a clear November morning in 2004, accompanied by the voice of a weapons systems officer describing what he saw. Released in December 2017, confirmed authentic by the Pentagon in April 2020. Still in the public record. Still in the official record. Real, documented, examined from multiple directions by people with relevant expertise, and still, quietly without drama, in the way that genuine open questions tend to persist, unexplained. The gray-white of the infrared sky where the return had been is still there. At the end of the footage, the reticle still holds the empty space. The recording is still in the archive, exactly as it was when it was captured. The same data, the same audio, the same 1 minute and 16 seconds of November morning over the Pacific, sitting in the official record where the Pentagon placed it, in the column marked unidentified, on an April morning in 2020, where it remains. Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich sat in a television studio in 2021 under bright lights in a chair across from a correspondent, and she spoke about a morning in November 2004 when she watched something she had no name for move above the Pacific Ocean. She was not anonymous. She used her name. She described the object in the specific, unhurried way that pilots describe aircraft, its shape, its absence of surfaces, the quality of its movement against the sky, and she said that in all of her years of flying, she had never seen anything that compared to it. That choice, to speak publicly and attach her name to the account, made it something different from a rumor or a second-hand report. It placed a second named naval aviator, a woman with a career and a record, in the formal history of November 14th, 2004, and in doing so, it gave that morning a second anchor in the record, not just Commander Fravor's account held alone, but two independent descriptions of the same white oblong shape, the same absence of propulsion features, the same maneuvering behavior above the same stretch of open ocean. Dietrich had flown as Fravor's wingman on that sortie. She had her own angle on the object, her own canopy, her own eyes. What she reported seeing matched Fravor's account in its essential details without being identical to it, which is the particular quality that makes independent corroboration meaningful rather than simply redundant. She described the object as smooth and white. She noted the absence of any visible wings or exhaust. She described its movement as unlike anything in the normal vocabulary of flight. Not the movement of a fixed-wing aircraft, not the movement of a rotary aircraft, not any movement that belonged to the performance envelopes she had spent her career learning to read. And she said in that lit studio 17 years after the fact that the encounter had no analog in her experience, that the word she reached for and then set aside as insufficient was unsettling, not because the object had threatened her, but because it had simply declined to fit into any category she had available. What Dietrich's public corroboration did was quiet and structural. It did not add dramatic new details. It added the weight of a second named person speaking under her own identity, who was there and saw what she saw and chose to say so. The Nimitz incident had, in the years between 2004 and 2021, accumulated a documentary record. There were radar logs, cockpit communications, internal Navy reports, and one piece of infrared footage. But the center of the record had always been the accounts of the people who were present, and the decision by a named naval aviator to add her voice to that center in a public forum in her own words was the kind of quiet act that changes the shape of a record without making noise about it. Senior Chief Kevin Day organized his memory the way a trained operations specialist organizes sensor data. He kept the details of late October and early November 2004 in a particular order: altitude readings, bearing, duration, the character of each return as it appeared on the AN/SPY1B display, and then dropped toward the ocean surface. He had been the Princeton's primary radar operator during the detection window, and what he had tracked across those days was still, years later, arranged in his memory with the precision of filed data. The contacts had appeared repeatedly. They had descended from altitudes that exceeded the operational ceiling of conventional military aircraft. They had moved in ways that did not correspond to any performance profile in his experience, and they had done this across multiple days in the same general area of ocean without offering any of the identifying characteristics that distinguish known objects from unknown ones. Day gave sworn statements about what he had seen on those screens. He said publicly and on record that the radar returns from that detection window represented the most inexplicable data of his Navy career. He carried this account forward through the years after his service, and when he spoke about it, he spoke with the flat specificity of a man describing instrument readings rather than a man describing something he needed others to believe. The data was what it was. The tracks were what they were. He had watched them appear and drop and reappear for days, and neither he nor his colleagues had found a satisfactory explanation, and no explanation had been provided to them from outside the ship. What he described and what he maintained across multiple accounts was the professional experience of a sensor specialist who had observed something that his instruments registered and his training could not account for, and the specific lasting quality of carrying that gap forward through the years without resolution. Day also stated that something happened after the encounters were over. He described individuals arriving on the Princeton who were not members of the regular crew, who removed recorded radar data from the ship, and who provided no explanation for what they were taking or why. This account is recorded in his public statements and in his sworn testimony, and it is presented here as precisely what it is, a claim made by a named witness in documented form, available in the public record, neither confirmed nor refuted by any other source with access to what actually occurred. The data Day maintained was gone, whether what he described was a routine intelligence retrieval, a classified program protecting its data, or something else. No official account has been offered. The removal is documented in his testimony. Its purpose is not. What Day reported experiencing in the period following the encounters was something he described as lasting psychological disturbance, sleep disruption, a difficulty settling into the ordinary rhythms of his days that he attributed to having sat with an unexplained observation for which no institutional processing had been offered. He had seen something he could not account for. He had tracked it across 2 weeks. He had watched it behave in ways that had no precedent in his experience, and then the data that documented what he had seen had been taken off the ship, and no one had told him why, and no one had told him what the objects were. He carried that open space forward. He is still carrying it, As far as the public record reflects, a retired operations specialist with a precise and detailed account of 2 weeks in November 2004, waiting on the same explanation that has not yet arrived. The object that Fravor and Dietrich saw above the Pacific on the morning of November 14th, 2004, entered the formal record through channels that were not designed to receive it easily. The Navy's reporting systems, the military's classification architecture, the procedural frameworks for documenting encounters. These were built for the ordinary traffic of military operations, and what had been reported fell outside their usual categories in ways that the systems were not immediately equipped to address. Reports were filed, accounts were collected. Internal discussions occurred at levels of the chain of command that are not fully documented in the public record. And for years, the incident sat in that space, documented internally, not publicly acknowledged, carried by the people who had been present in the particular private way that witnesses carry things when no official framework exists to hold what they observed. The public record changed in December 2017 when the New York Times published its investigation into the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, and the FLIR 1 footage entered general circulation for the first time. What happened in the months and years after that publication was a gradual institutional shift in how the United States government chose to relate to the documented category of unidentified aerial phenomena. The shift was not sudden. It did not announce itself. It accumulated across press statements and congressional hearings and formal acknowledgments and quietly revised procedural frameworks, the specific slow way that institutions move when they are changing how they approach something they had previously preferred not to address publicly. In June 2021, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released a preliminary assessment report on unidentified aerial phenomena that covered 144 UAP reports collected from U.S. government personnel between 2004 and 2021. The report was 9 pages long. It was available to any member of the public who chose to read it. It identified only one of the 144 cases as having a high confidence conventional explanation. It noted explicitly that unidentified aerial phenomena represented a potential challenge to both flight safety and national security. It did not endorse any specific explanatory category for the remaining cases. It did not rule out any specific explanatory category. What it did was acknowledge in plain institutional language that trained government personnel had reported 144 encounters with aerial objects they could not identify, that only one of those encounters had been satisfactorily explained, and that the question of what the remaining objects were remained open. The Nimitz case was not named separately in the report. It was understood by those familiar with the documented UAP record to be among the foundational cases within the report's scope, one of the encounters that had made the inquiry necessary in the first place. The 9 pages of that report sit in the public record on a government server. They can be accessed and read today in the same form they were released in June 2021. The language is administrative and measured. The conclusions are specific and narrow. The document does not resolve the question it was written to address, and it does not present its lack of resolution as anything other than an honest accounting of what the inquiry found and did not find. What remains true about it, and what gives it a particular quality in the accumulated record of this case, is that it exists at all. A formal assessment by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, released publicly, acknowledging 143 unresolved encounters. The Nimitz encounter, November 14, 2004, understood to be among them. Commander Fravor sat at a witness table in a congressional hearing room in 2023 and gave testimony about what he had seen nearly 2 decades earlier. The room had fluorescent lighting and a long committee table, and the particular institutional quality of a space designed for official proceedings. A court reporter was present. The transcript was being made. What Fravor said in that room, what he had said across multiple congressional appearances in both closed and open sessions through the preceding years, was the same thing he had said consistently since the account became public. He described an object approximately 40 feet in length, white and smooth, with no wings, no rotors, no tail surfaces, no canards, no exhaust plume, no identifying markings. He described the way it had hovered at low altitude above the Pacific and then ascended toward him as he descended toward it. He described the way it had departed, the absence of the departure, really, the simply gone quality of a thing that had been there and then was not, without leaving the marks that departing things leave. And he stated, again, that nothing he had seen in his career as a naval aviator and no classified program he had been made aware of accounted for what he had observed. His testimony entered the formal written record of the United States Congress one more time. The account was unchanged. The explanation it pointed toward was still not there. There is a particular quality to an account that has been told consistently across many years and many forums without significant variation. It is not the quality of a story that has been polished for performance. Stories shaped for audiences tend to acquire new details over time, elaborations, amplifications, the specific inflation that comes from telling something to people who want it to be more than it was. Fravor's account had not done that. The core details, the shape, the size, the absence of propulsion features, the mirroring ascent, the instantaneous departure, the reappearance at the Seat point had remained stable across press interviews and congressional hearings and public appearances across more than a decade. What the stability of the account produced was something that investigators and researchers in this field have noted as one of the more significant characteristics of high-quality witness testimony. Not drama, not certainty about what the object was. Just a consistent, specific description of what a trained professional had observed, held steady through the years by the particular durability of a direct experience that was genuinely unusual. Lieutenant Commander Dietrich's account carried that same quality of stability. When she spoke in 2021, she was describing something she had seen in 2004, and the description matched the broad outlines of what Fravor had reported without being a simple repetition of it. She had her own position in the air that morning. She had her own angle on the object, her own visual field, her own professional framing of what she was seeing, and what she described from that independent position matched in its essential features what the man flying ahead of her and below him had described from his. 2 pilots, 2 canopies, 2 independent visual acquisitions of the same object on the same morning, and 2 accounts that held together across the years without requiring each other to remain coherent. The All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office was formally established in July 2022 under the National Defense Authorization Act. Its mandate was to coordinate UAP investigation across all military branches and intelligence agencies and to report its findings to Congress. It was the most institutionally expansive official response to unidentified aerial phenomena yet established, a dedicated office with a formal legislative basis tasked with receiving, evaluating, and systematically addressing a category of observation that the American military had, for most of its institutional history, had no formal structure to process at all. The office sits within the Pentagon. Reports submitted through standardized military reporting channels come to it. The Nimitz case occupies some position in its database, a file, a case number, a set of documented observations from November 2004 and the 2 weeks preceding it, sitting in a column alongside other cases that carry the same designation, unresolved. What the establishment of that office represented, in the quiet way that institutional acts carry meaning beyond their stated function, was an acknowledgement that the category of observation the Nimitz crew had submitted reports about in 2004 was real enough and persistent enough and documented enough to warrant a permanent official address. The office was not established because of the Nimitz case alone. There were 143 other reports in the ODNI's preliminary assessment. There were decades of documented military encounters preceding the ODNI's assessment window. There was a long accumulation of reported observations that had, through the years, found their way into internal military files without producing any systematic institutional response. The ARO was that response. Finally arrived, not a resolution, but a structure for sitting with the unresolved in a more organized and accountable way than had existed before. Fravor's consistent testimony across those congressional appearances had been one of the factors that shaped the political environment in which the AAOR became possible. The decision by named, credentialed military personnel to speak publicly and under oath about what they had observed gave the congressional interest in UAP a specific documented foundation. Not vague claims from unidentified sources, but sworn accounts from a commanding officer of a Navy fighter squadron, from a second pilot who had been present, from a senior radar specialist who had tracked the objects across 2 weeks. The institutional response, slow as it was a response to a record that those named witnesses had helped to build by choosing to speak. The ocean southwest of San Diego continues to move the way it moved in November 2004. The swells cross the operating area in the same long, slow patterns they always have, lifting and settling the surface, catching the November light in the same deep blue-gray that the water held on the morning Fravor descended toward the white shape, hovering above it. The operating area is still there. The strike group rotation continues through it in the ordinary way of military training schedules, carrier groups cycling through their workup evolutions, radar operators sitting at their consoles in the combat information centers of their ships and watching the familiar pattern of tracks that belong to the operating zone. What those operators know, now in the way that people within an institution come to know things that have entered the institutional memory, is that the operating area held something in November 2004 that the instruments recorded and the witnesses described and the official record has not yet accounted for. Kevin Day's radar tracks from that detection window exist in the form of whatever survived the removal he described. The tracks he carries in his memory exist with the full precision of a trained operator's recall, altitude, bearing, duration, behavior. Fravor's account exists in congressional transcripts, in media interviews, and documentary records, and the specific durable form of a story told the same way many times across many years. Dietrich's account exists in the public record in its 2021 form, quiet and specific, and spoken under her own name. The FLIR 1 footage exists in the Pentagon's official files, designated authentic, depicting unidentified aerial phenomena. And the ODNI's preliminary assessment report exists on a government server, 9 pages long, with 143 of its 144 cases still officially unresolved. These things sit together in the record, the way evidence sits when it has accumulated sufficiently to constitute a case, not a case that has been closed, but a case that is formally open, with documented materials, with named witnesses, with physical recordings, with official acknowledgments, and with the specific open space where the explanation has not yet arrived. The case was opened by what the Princeton's radar operators observed across the last days of October and the first 2 weeks of November 2004. It was extended by what Fravor and Dietrich observed through their canopies on the morning of November 14th. It was documented by the FLIR 1 footage recorded on the second sortie. It was entered into the congressional record by testimony given across multiple sessions, across multiple years, and it was formally designated as unresolved by the same institution, the United States government, that operates the Navy that sent the Princeton into that operating area, and the Nimitz with its air wing, and the F/A-18 F Super Hornets that climbed above the Pacific toward a contact that could not be explained. There is a particular kind of open that a case like this holds, not the open of something freshly unknown, where the investigation is still in progress and the explanation might arrive at any moment, but the open of something that has been examined carefully from multiple angles by multiple competent parties over many years and has remained precisely what it was at the beginning. The contact appeared on the Princeton's radar at extreme altitude and dropped toward the ocean's surface. The pilots flew to the coordinates and found a white oblong object hovering above a disturbance in the water. The object ascended and departed and reappeared at a coordinate 60 miles away. The infrared footage was recorded, the accounts were given, the reports were filed. The oversight structure was built, and the object remains, in the official language of the United States government, unidentified. What the Nimitz crew saw on that November morning exists in the record in the same form it has always held, specific, witnessed, documented, and without a satisfying account of what it was. The object above the Pacific was white. It was smooth. It was approximately 40 feet long. It had no wings, no rotors, no tail surfaces, no exhaust, no markings. It moved in ways that no identified technology available to the people who observed it could produce. It departed without leaving a contrail, without producing a sonic boom, without generating a detectable thermal signature. And then it was gone, and the air where it had been was simply the Pacific air again, blue and open, and the ocean below it moved on in the long swells it has always made. Fravor landed the Super Hornet and filed his report. Dietrich landed and filed hers. Day logged his radar tracks and continued his watch. Slayton, his weapons systems officer, brought back the FLIR 1 footage. The Princeton continued its radar watch over the operating area. The strike group continued its training evolution in the days that followed, moving through the scheduled workup exercises, the flight deck cycling through its launch and recovery operations, the Combat Information Center maintaining its watch over the familiar contact patterns of the Southern California operating area. The extraordinary morning had ended, and the carrier group had returned to the ordinary rhythms of pre-deployment training, and the explanation had not come, and November 2004 moved on into the record. The witnesses carried their accounts forward into the years that followed, each in their own way. Fravor carried his into press interviews and congressional testimony and the ongoing public life of a case that had grown through the years into something considerably larger than the operational report he had filed in November 2004. Dietrich carried hers more quietly until 2021, when she chose to add her voice to the public record in the specific weighted way of a second named pilot, saying that she had been there and she had seen it too. Field day. carried his with the particular heaviness of someone who had tracked the phenomena across 2 weeks on his instruments and then watched the data leave the ship without explanation, and who had found in the aftermath of that experience a disturbance that outlasted his service. The carrying is documented too in the interviews and the testimony and the public appearances where these individuals chose to speak, and in the ongoing, undramatic fact of their accounts remaining available in the public record, consistent, specific, and unrebutted by any official explanation. The ARO receives its reports. The Congressional Oversight Committees hear their testimony. The ODNI releases its assessments. The file on the Nimitz encounter sits in whatever database holds such cases, with its case number and its accumulated documentation, and the column marked explanation remains empty in the particular way that columns remain empty when the thing that would fill them has not been found. The bureaucratic emptiness is not alarming. It is simply accurate, an honest representation in official form of what is actually known. What is known is what the witnesses reported, what the instruments recorded, what the footage shows, and what the formal assessments have found. What is not known is what the object was. The question sits in that official space with the patience of a question that does not require an answer in order to persist. It was asked on a November morning in 2004 by a white oblong shape hovering above the Pacific without wings or exhaust or identifying markings, moving in ways that the trained observers who watched it could not account for. It was formalized into the congressional record across multiple years of testimony. It was institutionalized by the establishment of a dedicated federal office to hold it, and the cases like it in an organized and accountable way, and it remains in the official language of the United States government, in the sworn testimony of named naval officers, in the public accounts of trained radar specialists, in 1 minute and 16 seconds of authenticated infrared footage, exactly what it was at the beginning: open, documented, unresolved, and quietly persistent. The Princeton's radar operators knew that stretch of ocean the way anyone knows a space they have worked in for a long time. Its ordinary textures, its familiar patterns, the specific quality of routine that belongs to a place whose rhythms have become second nature. They knew what the normal contacts looked like on the Spy 1B display. They knew the traffic patterns of the operating area, the timing of the training aircraft, the signature of maritime vessels moving along their predictable routes through the water below. The familiarity was professional and complete, and what appeared on those screens in late October 2004 and returned across the days that followed did not belong to any of those familiar patterns. It came from outside the vocabulary of the known. It descended from altitudes that conventional aircraft do not reach, at rates of descent that conventional aircraft do not achieve, and it appeared and reappeared in the same stretch of ocean without the identifying characteristics that would have placed it in any category the operators had a name for. They watched it across 2 weeks, they logged it, they diagnosed their equipment. They ran their system checks and found no malfunction, no calibration error, no software artifact that would account for what they were seeing. The contacts continued,